Picture this. You're a powerful queen, surrounded by women who've sworn to protect you with their lives. They know your deepest secrets, brush your hair, hold your hand when you're sick, and whisper comfort in your darkest hours. They're closer than sisters, until the day one of them slips poison into your wine. Throughout history, the deadliest betrayals didn't come from enemy armies or rival kingdoms. They came from the women queens trusted most, their own ladies-in-waiting, who transformed intimate knowledge into lethal weapons. But here's the shocking twist. These weren't random acts of madness. There's a terrifying pattern that reveals something dark about power, trust, and human nature itself. Like and subscribe to uncover history's most chilling betrayals. The poison dripped silently into the golden chalice, while Queen Joanna of Naples smiled at her ladies-in-waiting, never suspecting that one of them had just sealed her mortal fate. It was 1382, and the palace of Castel dell'Ovo gleamed under the Mediterranean sun like an earthly paradise. But behind the silk curtains and carpets embroidered with golden threads, the death of one of medieval Europe's most powerful women was being conspired. Joanna had spent her entire life surrounded by women who had sworn to protect her, serve her, and honor her until death. But now she would discover that the most lethal betrayal always comes from those we trust most. The history of queens assassinated by their own ladies is a dark chronicle of how power corrupts not only those who exercise it, but also those who live in its shadow, transforming loyalty into envy and devotion into murderous desire. Ladies-in-waiting were far more than mere ornamental servants in the medieval court. They were daughters of high nobility, educated to be intellectual and emotional companions to the queen, confidants of her most intimate secrets and witnesses to her most vulnerable humanity. They knew every weakness, every fear, every secret desire of their sovereigns. They knew when the queen cried alone at night, when she doubted her decisions, when she felt betrayed by her husband or threatened by political enemies. This extraordinary intimacy created bonds that could be stronger than family blood, but it also generated opportunities for betrayals that were all the more devastating for the intimate relationships that preceded them. Joanna the Fervide of Naples had been queen since she was 16, a young woman forced to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval Italian politics with only her intelligence and determination as guides. She was an extraordinarily cultured woman for her time, spoke 4 languages, protected artists and writers, and administered her kingdom with a competence that made her male enemies gnaw with envy. But Joanna made the fatal mistake of trusting too much in Margherita di Durazzo, one of her closest ladies. A woman who had grown up in the palace and whom Joanna considered almost a sister. Margherita was beautiful, intelligent, and apparently devoted to the queen, but behind her sweet smile fermented an ambition that had been fed by years of subtle humiliations and unfulfilled promises. The conspiracy against Joanna began when she refused to name Margherita as heir to certain properties that the lady had coveted for years. For Margherita, this refusal was not just a political disappointment, but a personal humiliation that revealed how the queen really saw her, not as an equal, but as a subordinate who should be grateful for any crumb of royal favor. From that moment, Margherita began cultivating secret relationships with Joanna's enemies, offering information about the queen's habits, fears, and vulnerabilities in exchange for promises of future rewards. She became a spy within the very heart of royal power, a traitor who kissed the queen's cheeks in the morning and planned her death at night. The chosen poison was arsenic mixed with mercury, a lethal combination that caused a slow and agonizing death, but which could easily be confused with a natural disease. Margherita had learned about poisons from a Florentine alchemist whom she seduced and then blackmailed to obtain the necessary information. For weeks, she administered small doses in Joanna's food and drink, causing symptoms that seemed like a mysterious fever that left the queen increasingly weak and confused. The court physicians, all men who already distrusted a woman's capacity to govern, interpreted the illness as divine punishment for Joanna's arrogance in exercising masculine power, never suspecting they were witnessing a carefully orchestrated murder. While Joanna wasted away in her chambers, Margherita played the role of faithful and dedicated lady, spending hours beside the sick queen, holding her hand, wiping her sweat, and whispering words of comfort that were actually cruel ironies. "Don't worry, Your Majesty. I will take care of everything while Your Highness recovers," Margherita would say, knowing perfectly well that there would be no recovery, only a slow and painful death. The Queen, in her agonizing naivety, felt grateful to have such a loyal friend by her side in her final moments, never realizing that this same friend was the author of her suffering. Joanna's death was officially attributed to a malignant fever, but rumors of poisoning circulated through the court like ghosts whispering inconvenient truths. Margherita inherited several of the Queen's properties and quickly married a Hungarian nobleman who had been a declared enemy of Joanna, confirming the suspicions of those who still had eyes to see the truth. But medieval justice was slow and corrupt, especially when the suspects were powerful people with influential connections. Margherita lived 20 more years in luxury and comfort, was never formally accused of the murder, and died in her bed surrounded by children and grandchildren who believed she had been a virtuous and respectable woman. But Joanna's story was not an isolated case. In the French court of the 14th century, Marguerite de Bourgogne faced an even more brutal betrayal from her own ladies. Marguerite was the wife of Louis VI the Stubborn, and had been accused of adultery in a scandal that shook the French monarchy to its roots. Her ladies-in-waiting, led by Blanche d'Artois, were bribed by the Queen's enemies to testify falsely against her, inventing detailed stories about love affairs that never happened. Blanche had been raised from childhood to serve Marguerite, had shared her most intimate secrets, and had sworn to protect her with her own life. But when they offered her properties and titles in exchange for her testimony, she betrayed her mistress with a cruelty that shocked even the standards of the time. Marguerite's trial was a judicial farce, where her own ladies provided the most intimate and damaging details. Blanche described with surgical precision the Queen's personal habits, her schedules, her preferences, creating a narrative of betrayal that seemed completely convincing because it came from someone who really knew every aspect of Marguerite's life. The Queen was sentenced to death based mainly on the testimony of women who had been her closest companions, her confidants, her almost sisters. Marguerite was strangled in her cell at Château Gaillard prison, but before dying she managed to send a message to Blanche: "May God forgive you because I cannot." Marguerite's execution revealed something even more sinister about the nature of feminine betrayals in the medieval court. Blanche had not betrayed the Queen for money or properties, but for something much more disturbing: envy. For years she had watched Marguerite be admired, courted, respected, while she herself remained in the shadows, as a secondary figure. Marguerite's beauty, her intelligence, her power of seduction were constant sources of psychological torture for Blanche, who felt diminished by the constant comparison. When the opportunity arose to destroy the one who had been the object of her secret envy, Blanche embraced it with a passion that revealed the depth of her hidden resentment. In 15th century England, Elizabeth Woodville faced an even more elaborate conspiracy from her own ladies. Elizabeth was a controversial queen, seen by many as a commoner who had seduced King Edward IV and usurped the place of nobler queens. Her ladies-in-waiting, primarily Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Talbot, were women of the highest nobility who deeply resented having to serve someone they considered socially inferior. The conspiracy against Elizabeth was years in preparation, involving not only her ladies but also a complex network of discontented nobles who saw in the Queen a symbol of everything that was wrong with the English monarchy. Margaret Beaufort was a woman of exceptional intelligence and unlimited ambition, mother of the future King Henry VII, and one of the most skillful politicians of her time. She had accepted the position of Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting not out of loyalty, but as a spying opportunity that would allow her to learn the most intimate secrets of the Yorkist royal family. For years, Margaret smiled at Elizabeth, participated in her intimate conversations, offered apparently sincere advice while secretly recording every word, every gesture, every weakness that could be used against the Queen in the future. She was a viper disguised as a friend, a traitor who transformed intimacy into a political weapon. Elizabeth's downfall began when Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, leaving her vulnerable to attacks from her enemies. Margaret Beaufort immediately activated her spy network, using information obtained during her years as lady-in-waiting to help Richard III delegitimize Elizabeth's children and usurp the throne. The private conversations that Elizabeth had shared with Margaret about her concerns regarding the legitimacy of her marriage were distorted and used as evidence that her children were bastards with no right to the throne. The intimate trust that Elizabeth had placed in her lady was transformed into the weapon that destroyed her dynasty. Elizabeth Talbot played an even more direct role in the betrayal. As lady-in-waiting, she had access to the Queen's private chambers and knew all the secret passages of the palace. When Elizabeth's children were imprisoned in the Tower of London, Elizabeth Talbot provided crucial information about their routines and habits that facilitated their eventual disappearance. She knew exactly when and where the young princes would be most vulnerable, information she obtained through apparently innocent conversations with her queen about Elizabeth's maternal concerns. The lady transformed maternal love into lethal information. But perhaps the most shocking betrayal was that of Anne Stafford against Catherine of Braganza, consort queen of Charles II of England in the 17th century. Anne was not only Catherine's lady-in-waiting, but also her distant cousin, and one of the few people at the English court who spoke Portuguese fluently. Catherine, a Portuguese princess who felt lost in the English court, depended completely on Anne to navigate the complexities of British politics. Anne was her eyes, her ears, her literal and cultural interpreter of the society that Catherine never fully managed to understand. The betrayal began when Anne fell in love with King Charles II himself, a man known for his numerous mistresses and his inability to resist a beautiful woman. Anne began using her privileged position to subtly sabotage the relationship between Catherine and the king, reporting distorted conversations, exaggerating minor conflicts, and gradually painting the Queen as a difficult woman, too religious and culturally incompatible with England. At the same time, Anne positioned herself as the perfect alternative, English, Protestant, understanding, and totally devoted to the king's interests above any other loyalty. Catherine never fully discovered the extent of Anne's betrayal, but began to suspect when she noticed that her marital problems always seemed to escalate after conversations with her lady-in-waiting. The Portuguese queen was a woman too simple and honest to understand the subtle psychological games that Anne was playing, but her feminine intuition eventually alerted her that something was wrong. When Catherine finally confronted Anne about her suspicions, the lady denied everything with tears in her eyes and protests of innocence that seemed completely sincere. "How can your majesty doubt me, who have sacrificed my own life to serve you?" Anne cried in a performance that would have been worthy of London's best. The truth was only revealed years later, when Anne married a rich and powerful English nobleman, a man who had been a declared enemy of Catherine, and who obviously had rewarded Anne for her espionage services. Catherine spent the rest of her life in England as a marginalized queen, never managing to produce the heir the kingdom expected, always suspecting that her marital difficulties had been artificially created by someone she had trusted completely. Anne's betrayal was particularly cruel because it exploited not only Catherine's political vulnerability, but also her cultural loneliness as a foreigner in a hostile land. The pattern that emerges from these stories is disturbing in its consistency. The queens who were betrayed by their ladies were not evil or cruel women who deserved their fates. They were powerful women who made the human mistake of trusting too much in those who surrounded them, of believing that intimacy created loyalty, of assuming that people who knew their secrets also respected their humanity. Their betrayers were not obviously malicious criminals, but intelligent and ambitious women who resented living in the shadow of other women more powerful or more favored by destiny. The psychology behind these betrayals reveals dark aspects of human nature that we prefer not to recognize. Intimate proximity to power can corrupt in much more subtle and dangerous ways than the open pursuit of authority. The ladies who killed their queens were corrupted not by thirst for political power, but by daily envy, by resentment at always being the second most important person in any room, by bitterness at intimately knowing the defects and weaknesses of someone the world saw as superior. They killed not to conquer thrones, but to destroy what they could not have, the admiration, respect, love that were directed toward other women. These stories also reveal the unique vulnerability of women in power during historical periods when they depended almost completely on other women to navigate the social and political complexities of their positions. Without sisters, daughters, or close relatives they could trust, queens turned to their ladies-in-waiting for the emotional and practical support they needed to survive in hostile environments. This dependence created opportunities for betrayals that were all the more devastating for the trust that was necessary and preceded them. But the most chilling aspect of these historical betrayals lies not in their individual cruelty, but in their systematic nature. The pattern repeats across centuries and kingdoms with such consistency that it suggests something deeper about the relationship between power and proximity, between trust and opportunity, between love and destruction. Each queen believed herself to be unique, her relationship special, her trust well-placed. Each discovered too late that the very intimacy she treasured had become the weapon of her destruction. Consider the case of Isabella of Castile, the Catholic queen who unified Spain and launched the Age of Exploration. Even she, renowned for her political acumen and military strategy, fell victim to the treachery of her most trusted lady-in-waiting, Marguerite de Bourgogne. Isabella had elevated Beatrice from minor nobility to become one of the most powerful women in Spain, trusting her with state secrets and personal confidences that could have toppled kingdoms. But Beatrice harbored a secret resentment that festered like an infected wound. She had been in love with Ferdinand of Aragon before he married Isabella, and every day spent serving the royal couple was a reminder of the life she believed had been stolen from her. Beatrice's revenge was subtle and devastating. She began feeding information to Portuguese spies, revealing Isabella's military plans and diplomatic strategies in exchange for promises that she would be made Queen of Portugal when Isabella's regime collapsed. For 3 years, Beatrice systematically betrayed every confidence, leaked every secret, and undermined every policy while maintaining a facade of perfect loyalty. She would brush Isabella's hair while memorizing conversations about troop movements, would help the queen dress while planning which intelligence to sell to enemy agents, would offer comfort during Isabella's moments of doubt while secretly recording those vulnerabilities for future exploitation. The betrayal was discovered only when a Portuguese spy was captured with detailed maps of Spanish fortifications drawn in Beatrice's distinctive handwriting. When confronted with the evidence, Beatrice showed no remorse, instead declaring that Isabella had never deserved the crown that should have been hers by right of prior claim to Ferdinand's affections. "You stole my life," she told the queen who had trusted her above all others, "so I destroyed yours." Isabella had Beatrice executed, but the damage was irreversible. Years of leaked secrets had cost Spain thousands of lives and millions in gold, while the psychological impact of such intimate betrayal left Isabella unable to trust anyone completely for the remainder of her reign. The pattern extends even into more recent centuries, revealing that the vulnerability of powerful women to betrayal by those closest to them transcends historical periods and cultural contexts. In 18th century Russia, Catherine the Great faced a conspiracy orchestrated by her own lady-in-waiting, Princess Dashkova, a woman she had considered her closest friend and intellectual equal. Dashkova had helped Catherine seize power from her husband Peter III, had been rewarded with unprecedented authority for a woman in Russian society, and had enjoyed the Empress's complete confidence for over a decade. But Dashkova's gratitude gradually transformed into something much darker. As Catherine's reign progressed and her legend grew, Dashkova began to feel diminished by constant comparison to the woman she had helped create. The princess, who had once been celebrated as the power behind the throne, found herself increasingly marginalized as Catherine consolidated her authority and required less assistance in governing her vast empire. Dashkova's journals, discovered centuries later, reveal a mind consumed by jealousy and wounded pride. She forgets that without me, she would still be a frightened German princess, cowering before her husband's drunken rages. Yet she treats me as if I were merely another courtier seeking favors. Dashkova's attempted coup was as brilliant as it was treacherous. She allied herself with Catherine's son Paul, promising to help him claim the throne that was rightfully his, while simultaneously convincing him that his mother had grown too westernized, too liberal, too dangerous to Russian traditional values. For months, she worked to turn mother against son and son against mother, feeding each information about the other's supposed betrayals, while presenting herself as the only loyal voice in a court full of sycophants and traitors. The plot collapsed when Catherine's spies intercepted correspondence between Dashkova and foreign agents who had promised military support for Paul's coup. The letters revealed not only Dashkova's political treachery, but also her personal motivations. She had promised the foreign powers that Paul would be a more malleable ruler than his mother, easier to manipulate and control. The woman who had once fought to put Catherine on the throne was now willing to destroy Russia's independence, to satisfy her own wounded vanity. Catherine's response was swift, but not without mercy, influenced by their former friendship. Rather than execution, she chose exile, banishing Dashkova to remote estates where the princess would spend her remaining years writing bitter memoirs that blamed everyone but herself for her downfall. "I gave her everything," Catherine wrote in her private diary. "My trust, my friendship, my confidence, my love. In return, she gave me the knowledge that even the strongest bonds can be corrupted by the poison of ambition, unrewarded, and pride, unrequited." Perhaps the most psychologically complex case involves Marie Antoinette and her lady-in-waiting, Jeanne de la Motte Valois, a woman whose betrayal would ultimately contribute to the French Revolution itself. Jeanne was a distant relative of the royal family who had fallen into poverty, rescued by Marie Antoinette's charity and elevated to a position of trust within the royal household. The Queen, already unpopular with the French people for her Austrian origins and perceived extravagance, desperately needed allies she could trust completely, and in Jeanne she believed she had found a kindred spirit. Jeanne's treachery was motivated not by political ambition, but by a more primal force, the humiliation of dependency. Despite her noble bloodline, she was essentially a charity case, dependent on royal generosity for her very survival. Every gift from Marie Antoinette, every kindness, every display of trust was simultaneously a reminder of Jeanne's reduced circumstances and her inability to maintain her status through her own efforts. The psychology of charity creates its own forms of resentment, and Jeanne began to hate the very woman whose generosity had saved her from destitution. The infamous diamond necklace affair was Jeanne's masterpiece of revenge. She convinced Cardinal Rohan that Marie Antoinette desired the most expensive necklace in Europe, but could not afford to purchase it openly due to France's financial crisis. Using forged letters supposedly written by the Queen, Jeanne orchestrated an elaborate scheme in which the cardinal bought the necklace believing he was helping Marie Antoinette, while Jeanne stole the diamonds and sold them across Europe. When the deception was revealed, the scandal destroyed what remained of Marie Antoinette's reputation with the French people, who saw the affair as proof of their queen's frivolity and dishonesty. Marie Antoinette never recovered from the damage to her reputation caused by Jeanne's betrayal. The woman who had shown kindness to a poor relative was repaid with a scheme that painted her as greedy, deceptive, and contemptuous of her subjects' suffering. The necklace affair became one of the catalysts for the revolutionary fervor that would eventually lead to Marie Antoinette's execution, making Jeanne's betrayal not just personal, but historically consequential. The irony was not lost on observers. The Queen who died on the guillotine had been destroyed as much by the treachery of those she trusted as by the anger of those she failed to understand. The pattern of betrayal by ladies-in-waiting reveals something profound about the nature of power relationships between women. In historical contexts where formal authority was rare, but informal influence was crucial, these women lived in a world where proximity to power was often the only power available to them, where influence exercised through intimate relationships was their primary means of affecting their own destinies. The tragedy is that this system created conditions where loyalty and treachery became indistinguishable, where the same intimacy that enabled influence also enabled destruction. The queens who died or suffered at the hands of their ladies-in-waiting were not victims of random violence or political upheaval, but casualties of a more insidious force, the corruption of trust by proximity to power. They learned too late that the women they had elevated, trusted, and loved were capable of transforming that very elevation, trust and love, into weapons of unprecedented, devastating efficiency. Their stories serve as eternal warnings that in the dangerous game of power, the most lethal enemies are often those who sleep closest to our hearts, who know our weaknesses because we trusted them with our vulnerabilities, who can destroy us most completely because they understand exactly what we have to lose. The legacy of these murdered and betrayed queens extends far beyond their individual tragedies. Their stories illuminate the particular vulnerabilities that women in power face when their authority depends partly on personal relationships and emotional bonds that men in similar positions rarely require. They reveal how the very qualities that made these women effective rulers, their capacity for trust, their willingness to form intimate bonds, their belief in loyalty as a reciprocal virtue, could be turned against them by those who understood these qualities better than the queens understood the darker aspects of human nature. In the end, The queens who were betrayed by their ladies-in-waiting died not because they were weak, but because they were human in contexts where humanity was a luxury they could not afford. They loved where they should have calculated, trusted where they should have suspected, and forgave where they should have punished. Their deaths were not random tragedies, but inevitable conclusions to relationships built on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of power, loyalty, and human character. They remain as warnings across the centuries that in the realm of absolute power, there are no relationships so intimate that they cannot be corrupted, no trust so complete that it cannot be betrayed, and no love so pure that it cannot be transformed into an instrument of destruction.